The morning he handed her the divorce papers, Clara did not cry. She simply watched the silver brush slip from her fingers and roll across the floor, leaving a thin trail of paint like a wound that refused to close. That single moment, quiet yet devastating, became the line between who she was and who she would become. She had lost a marriage, a friend, and the life she built, but from the silence of that fall, a far greater story was about to rise. The silver brush trembled between Clara Weston's fingers as the studio door opened. The morning light had lain across her drafting table like a fresh sheet of paper, pale and clean, until Ethan stepped in and shaded the white with his shape. He said nothing at first. He crossed the room, placed a rectangle of off-white card upon the table, and pressed it flat with 2 fingers, as if smoothing air bubbles beneath a film that would cover everything. "Let us make it official," he said. "I will wire you $1,000 a month. That should cover your hobbies." He did not ask how she had slept. He did not ask if her hand ached from the hours at the easel. He did not ask if she was afraid. The silver brush slipped from her grasp. It struck the hardwood with a small, bright sound and rolled until its ferrule kissed the baseboard. A thin ribbon of paint marked its journey like a vein of mercury across a map. Clara did not reach for it. She looked at the card. The letters were black and professional. The words were the end of something that had once been soft. The studio smelled of paper, coffee gone cool, and the buttery trace of linseed. A single robin outside repeated a phrase as if it had forgotten the rest of the song. Ethan waited. When she did not move, he tapped the card twice. "There is a number. Call it. The sooner we finish, the better for both of us." A long time ago, a scene like this would have torn her voice into wild, breaking pieces. But this morning a strange stillness lifted inside her, like a tide that retreats and leaves the shore exposed. She heard the brush settle. She counted her breaths. She set her palm upon the table to steady herself, and in that small gesture she felt the grain of the wood, the familiar ridges, the honest texture of a surface that never lied. "All right," Clara said. Her voice surprised her with its calm. "All right." He exhaled, satisfied, and turned toward the door. His hand hesitated on the handle, just long enough to become a question. Then he left. The robin sang again, the same fragment, the same unfinished thought. Clara knelt, lifted the silver brush, and examined the thin dent near the ferrule. A life has only so many dents, she thought. She cleaned the bristles with quiet, circular motions, and when the water ran clear, she laid the brush upon a folded cloth the way a nurse might lay an instrument to rest. The card sat where he had left it. She slid it beneath the corner of a sketch she had been working on, a field of pastel clouds where 2 children chased a kite toward an impossible horizon. The kite string had begun to fray under her hand. She placed the silver brush above it and left the line unmended. There had been a time when the horizon felt like a promise. That time had a shape. It began on a July morning when the air over Seattle shimmered and the market stalls smelled of strawberries and wet rope. Clara had stood beside Lydia Park in a second-hand bookshop where the ceiling fans turned lazily, and Lydia had held up a children's picture book with the reverence some reserve for scriptures. "You should do this," Lydia had said, her voice full of delight that always made her seem younger than she was. "You should make worlds and let children live in them." Clara had laughed and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She had not believed it then, but the idea had clung to her like chalk on her fingertips. Later that summer, she met Ethan at a friend's rooftop party. He had been gentle with his words and precise in his attention. He asked what she loved. She said color and the way a child's face changes when a story opens. He said he loved the way her hands moved as she spoke. He said that some people seemed to give light rather than borrow it. She remembered that line because he had believed it. Years folded, and there were winter walks and dinners with Lydia and Henry Miles, who would eventually marry Lydia with a promise that felt solid enough to stand on. Lydia laughed louder than anyone at the table and often reached across to touch Clara's wrist when she agreed with her. She was hungry for closeness in a way that had once seemed endearing. She had grown up in a house where television spoke louder than parents, where holidays were marked by takeout cartons and a single candle on the counter. If Lydia clung, Clara told herself, It was because the world had not clung to her. In those early years, Ethan admired Clara's steadfast joy the way a traveler admires a lighthouse. He brought her tea while she painted, never stepping inside the invisible perimeter of the canvas. He read drafts of her stories, and when she doubted, he told her to keep going. He wore her faith in him like a sweater in cold weather. The first hairline cracks were small enough to ignore. After Lydia announced her pregnancy, Ethan offered to drive her to an appointment because Henry had a meeting he could not move. It sounded kind. Clara approved. Then came a second appointment and a third. Ethan quit smoking because Lydia could not stand the smell. He changed his gym schedule because mornings made her nauseated and evenings calmed her. None of it, by itself, was terrible. Compassion is a habit, Clara thought then. Compassion becomes routine. But routine rewrote itself. Ethan stayed later at work and later still. His explanations were careful and unremarkable. A team rollout, a code review, a server migration that refused to behave. He smelled faintly of hotel air, that metallic chill, returned home with a new restlessness in his hands. Once, she asked if he wanted tea, and he said yes without looking up, and when she brought it to him, he had fallen asleep on the couch with his shoes still on, as if at any moment he might rise and fly away. Clara did not accuse. She watched. She set dinner for two and ate alone. She washed the second plate anyway, because leaving it dirty felt like acknowledging a change she was not prepared to name. On a Sunday morning, she wiped the kitchen table and noticed two cups cooling side by side, hers with a ring of bright lipstick on the rim and his untouched. A thin skin filmed over the surface. The sunlight through the blinds drew pale stripes across the wood. In that quiet, she felt the ache of a room that had forgotten how to breathe. When Henry knocked, it was evening in early rain, the kind that softens edges and turns streets into mirrors. He stood beneath the porch light with the posture of someone who had rehearsed what to say and then forgotten the script. He was a man who wore reliability the way others wore cologne. That night his face seemed borrowed from a stranger. "I am sorry to come unannounced," he began. "I need to ask a difficult question." Clara set a kettle on the stove and listened to its slow audition toward a boil. She gestured to a chair. Henry did not sit. He placed his phone on the table and slid it toward her. The screen showed a map of the city with a red pin that repeated like a stutter at the same address. "Hotel Maple," he said, and the rasp in his throat made the simple words heavy. 3 nights a week. For months. Clara's breath shortened, as if a seam had been drawn tight across her chest. The kettle sang. She turned the flame low and did not pour. She studied the pattern of pins, their regularity, their calm. She pictured a corridor with soft carpet and doors whispered shut. She pictured Lydia's hand at the back of her neck when she laughed. She pictured Ethan aligning his keys on the entry table until they made a perfect little line. "I could be wrong," Henry said, "because good men make room for doubt even when certainty has already taken the chair." Clara lifted the silver brush from the folded cloth beside the sink. She touched its bristles to a palette where a thin pool of red remained from a scene she had been painting earlier, a child's scarf flying behind her as she ran. She drew one small stroke across the corner of an old sketch, and the line bled like a cut. "I do not think you are wrong," she said. He sat then. He steadied his hands around the idea of a cup, even before she poured it. When she did pour, the kitchen filled with the clean scent of jasmine. They did not add milk. They did not add sugar. Some nights, after all, do not take sweetness. Henry spoke of weeks that had become months. Of questions that sounded like accusations even when he softened their edges. Of Lydia's laughter landing just to the left of sincerity. He did not weep. He wore the composure of a man who has learned that breaking in front of another person sometimes makes repair impossible. Clara listened. She wished to be kind to the past while telling the truth about the present. She imagined the small museum that every marriage contains, with its glass cases of moments, each labeled and lit. What would she label this one? The night the map began to speak. The hour the brush drew blood. When Henry left, the rain had deepened. The porch light threw its modest circle upon the steps, and the drops passed through it like actors crossing a narrow stage. Clara remained in the kitchen with the silver brush balanced in her open palm. It reflected the light in a thin, unwavering line. Her hand did not tremble. She returned to the studio and stood before the canvas. The field of pastel clouds waited, innocent as a child's question. She mixed a gray so soft it might have been a color remembered rather than seen. She laid it down carefully, letting it whisper through the pinks and blues. The kite faded at its edges. The children lost their faces and became only gestures, motion without names. She set the brush aside and opened a new sketchbook. The paper accepted the pencil with a gentleness that moved her. She drew two figures standing close, and then drew the air between them, becoming a wall. She shaded the wall until it seemed to thicken. She drew a door in the wall and then the outline of a key that fit no lock. She drew a woman holding a silver brush like a small sword and a small compass. She drew the line of her own mouth, straight and resolute. The studio quieted around her. The robin outside found the rest of its song and finished it. From somewhere in the building a child laughed, brief as a spark. Clara placed the sketchbook on the table beside the card that had arrived like a verdict and slid the card beneath the paper until it disappeared. That night she did not paint for the market or for a deadline or for an audience that might never learn her name. She drew for the part of her that understood the mathematics of lines and the mercy of light. She drew to say what could not be said at the kitchen table or on a phone call to a stranger in an office of brushed steel. That night, she stopped painting for others and started sketching her plan. The courthouse smelled of paper and polished stone. Clara Weston stood beside a wooden table while the clerk read the final paragraph in a voice as neutral as winter light. Ethan did not look at her. He adjusted his cuff and kept his gaze on the document as if the signature line were a narrow bridge he had to cross without slipping. When the clerk asked for their confirmation, Clara said yes in a calm tone that surprised her once again. She signed her name with a steady hand. Ethan signed with a flourish that pretended to be confidence. The pen clicked shut. A stamp came down. The sound was small and final, like a door closing in a distant corridor. Outside, the sky over Seattle held a thin, silver sun. Ethan cleared his throat to speak, then decided against it. He offered a half nod that did not become a farewell. Clara did not give one either. She took the elevator alone and watched her reflection lift and dissolve in the mirrored walls, a woman leaving a room that no longer contained her. Lydia Park's wedding arrived as if it had been waiting in the wings for the cue. Photos appeared everywhere, soft with filters, generous with gold. A vine-draped arch. A dress like a cloud at sunset. A caption beneath one image read, "Forever starts here." The sentence was confident. The sentence did not know itself. Clara scrolled through the album until her eyes blurred, then set the phone face down and let the apartment grow quiet around her. The silver brush lay on the windowsill, turning a slim blade of light back toward the room. She left Seattle at dawn 2 weeks later. Her studio fit into 5 boxes and 1 suitcase. She drove south while the highway unwound before her like a long gray ribbon. San Francisco received her with wind and a sky that seemed to lean forward to see her better. She found a walk-up apartment with a narrow balcony and a view of roofs, and she built a desk by the window with her own hands. She unpacked the silver brush and set it on a white cloth. She opened a new email account and a new folder on her computer. She signed a new name at the end of her messages. C.W. Harper. The first assignment arrived like a gull that saw the shore before anyone else. A small press asked for illustrations to accompany a set of poems about hospital gardens. Clara worked at night when the city softened and the trains along the water spoke in low voices. She painted flowers that refused to surrender, windows that kept the day safe inside them, nurses who leaned close with careful hands. The publisher wrote back in a rush of praise that felt like a tide at her ankles. They asked for more. She said yes. A second inquiry arrived. A larger house this time, with a contract whose numbers made her pause. Then a message from an agent who had collected her work through the quiet grace of recommendation. Then a call, bright with the word penguin, that hummed in her chest long after she placed the phone on the desk and let her fingers find the silver brush. She did not announce any of it. She let the work speak, and it spoke in ink, in color, in small proofs that landed on her doorstep like invitations that did not need permission. A studio executive requested a meeting about an animated adaptation. The meeting took place beneath high windows that gathered the afternoon into white squares of light on the floor. Clara presented a book dummy with stitched pages. She talked about shadows that move like thoughts. She talked about children who carry lanterns inside their ribs. She did not mention her former name. She did not need to. When the executive smiled and extended a hand, the future felt near enough to breathe on her wrist. "I told the world I was gone," she wrote in her notebook that night. "But I am painting again. This time for myself." She allowed herself one indulgence. She bought a wooden box to hold the silver brush and carved a small fox upon the lid. The fox looked over its shoulder, not in fear, but in acknowledgement of the path it had already crossed. Henry Miles rang her buzzer on a Sunday that tasted like salt and wind. He stood in the doorway with a shy posture that softened the lines of his suit. Behind him, Ella peered around his arm. In the months since Clara had seen her, the girl's face had lengthened, as if a sculptor had refined its angles while she slept. Ella came forward without prompting and held out a folded paper crane. "I made it on the train," she said. "For your window." Clara accepted the gift and felt its delicate weight. She placed the crane on the sill and invited them in. Henry carried a bag of oranges and a small, lopsided cake. He said he had baked it himself. Clara believed him. They ate at the small table by the balcony, and the air smelled of citrus and sugar, and the city watched them with 1,000 windows. The attachment between Clara and Ella did not require many words. It had begun years earlier in a hospital room where the blinds shook in the air from a vent and the monitors blinked with a patience that reassured no one. Ella was sick and feverish. Lydia had stepped out to take a call. Ethan had promised to return with soup and had not returned. Clara sat in a plastic chair and hummed a tune she had learned from her grandmother. She dipped the silver brush in water and drew a fox on a paper placemat, quick and gentle, a creature made of 3 graceful lines and a question mark tail. "You are safe," Clara had whispered. "I am here." That night, the fever broke and the memory stayed. The fox returned again and again in Ella's drawings, rarely perfect, always beloved. In San Francisco, after cake and tea, Henry set a careful hand on the table as if to anchor himself. He said he had found files on Lydia's old laptop, a folder she had not erased when she bought the newer model. The folder contained a timeline, a hidden calendar, and a single document with a clinic's letterhead. He slid an envelope across the table. The seal was broken. His face held the courtesy of a man who would prefer to be wrong. Clara lifted the paper and read. The words did not rush. They arrived as if walking down a hall, unhurried, clear. They said what Henry feared they would say. Ella's paternity had been established in a confidential test, conducted without Henry's knowledge. The date made the rest of the page unnecessary. Clara set the document down. She did not cry. She reached for the wooden box and opened it. The silver brush lay in its little nest of cloth, patient as a blade that refused to tarnish. She carried it to the easel where a half-finished sky waited, pale and hopeful. She lifted a small jar of black and tapped a careful drop onto the palette. The brush entered the dark and emerged sleek and resolute. Clara drew a single line through the sky. It was not thick. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of line that changes the meaning of the space around it. "So even innocence carries betrayal," she said, and her voice was soft and exact. Behind her, Henry drew a breath that did not become speech. Ella stood very still. The silver brush gleamed in Clara's hand, then relaxed, then rested. That night, she wrote an email. She read it twice and changed nothing. "It is time we draw the last line together." She pressed send. The city fell quiet in that attentive way cities sometimes have, as if every building were listening for the moment a story decides to turn. The silver brush lay upon the cloth, calm and ready. The sketch on the table showed a fox crossing a dark field toward a thin, unwavering dawn. The email Clara had sent felt like a drawn line that could not be erased. Morning arrived with a pale, unwavering light. Her attorney met her in a room of glass and quiet air and slid across the table a letter that announced itself without raising its voice. The words were orderly. They asked for nothing more than what the law already promised. There were no sharp edges. There was only the calm of a measured request, as if the sea had learned how to speak in paragraphs. "We proceed today," the attorney said. Clara nodded. She thought of the silver brush resting in its wooden box at home, a small instrument that had outlived storms. She pictured the bristles rising from water, clean and ready. She felt the same resolve. Across the city, a different meeting began. Henry Miles stepped into a boardroom high above Market Street, where the windows made the sky look domestic. He had become chief financial officer of a quiet, deliberate fund whose patience often won what haste could not. A portfolio manager presented a brief set of slides, numbers condensed into shapes even an impatient mind could respect. The company where Ethan Weston worked flickered upon the wall. It was not the first time it had appeared on such walls. It would be the last time with those colors. Henry listened. He asked 3 questions and declined to ask a 4th. The vote took less than a minute. Outside the conference room, he paused at the window and watched the wind move the fog across the bay. A sail tilted, regained its balance, and moved on. The letter reached Ethan that afternoon. He held it in both hands as if the paper required containment. The language was courteous and terminal. He read it twice and could not keep the words from dissolving and reassembling into versions of themselves that refused to be kind. He left the building and walked without direction until his reflection surprised him in the black glass of a bar door. Inside, the light was amber and slow. He sat where he could watch his hands and see whether they belonged to him. His fingers shook when he lifted the glass. Memories arrived in the efficient sequence of a machine. The rooftop where he had knelt with a simple ring. The night Clara had given him a wrapped box with laughter already in her eyes. Inside the box had been a silver brush with his initials engraved near the ferrule. "You can borrow my light," she had said. "Just return it when you are done." In the bar, the glass emptied and did not answer. A television murmured. At the far end of the counter, a man laughed at a joke and then apologized to no one in particular for laughing. Ethan put the letter into his coat pocket as if it were something that might break. Lydia received her own envelope at the townhouse she had decorated with whites that resisted fingerprints. The envelope was the color of cement. She laid it on the marble counter and walked around it as if it were a sleeping animal. When she opened it, the air changed. There were inquiries regarding the charitable fund she had helped administer. The questions were reasonable and, when assembled, unforgiving. Receipts wandered. Transfers did not explain themselves. Her signature looked like a path she had followed without knowing where it went. She sat in the kitchen and studied a photograph on the refrigerator, a square of a summer day that had refused to be obedient. In the picture, she and Ethan stood beneath a string of lights. Her dress shone like a bottled sunrise. His smile had the confidence of a man who does not expect the ground to move. She began to cry with the stubbornness of someone who had learned very early that tears do not bring anyone back. She pressed a knuckle to her teeth. "I just wanted someone to stay," she said to the empty room, and the sentence frightened her with its honesty. Clara did not celebrate. She bought a carton of milk and a small bundle of lilies and walked home as if she needed to arrive without being noticed. That evening Henry called and said the families would meet on Sunday, a meal intended to loosen a knot that had tightened for years. He asked if she wished to attend. "Yes," she said. "If Ella wants me there." "Ella asked for you first," he answered. The dining room at Henry's parents' house had seen holidays and apologies before. The table was generous, the light careful. Old photographs watched from frames that had outlasted fashions. A roast rested upon a platter as if sleep had found it early. The 2 sets of parents sat with the posture of people who had recently discovered that love and bewilderment can occupy the same chair. Ethan arrived in a suit that did not quite belong to his present life. Lydia wore a dress that would have made sense in a happier room. Henry poured water, passed bread, and listed the names of dishes as if naming them could return them to a simpler purpose. Ella waited until the plates found the laps they were meant for. Then she stood. She was taller than Clara remembered from the last visit. Her voice had grown a notch lower, but it held the same clarity as a bell struck with care. You both lied to me, Ella said, looking from her mother to Ethan. You lied for years, and when the truth began to push through the walls, you lied to keep the walls standing. No one reached for a glass. No one cleared a throat. Even the clock seemed to hesitate between seconds. But when I was 6 and I did not know how to make the room stop spinning, Ella continued. Turning toward Clara, she sat with me. She drew a fox so that I could watch something gentle move through the air. She hummed a song that did not know my name and sang it for me anyway. When I was scared, she stayed. Ella crossed to Clara and put her arms around her with the careful force of a person who has decided to hold on. Clara felt the warmth of a small heartbeat against her ribs. She placed a hand on the back of the girl's head. The lilies on the sideboard released a single bright note into the evening, as if even flowers could speak at the right distance. Ella let go and turned to Ethan. Her face did not accuse. It simply declared, "You are not my father," she said. "You are my mother's mistake." Ethan closed his eyes. A muscle moved in his jaw and then settled. Lydia's hand lifted and fell, a gesture that had forgotten its intention. The parents watched the table with heroic interest in the salt. Clara understood then that the rooms of the past had finished with her. She asked for a moment in private with Ethan and Lydia. Henry guided Ella into the garden, where late roses leaned against their own shadows. They met in the study, a room lined with books that had not yet failed anyone. Clara placed the wooden box upon the desk and opened it. The silver brush lay inside like a truth that had chosen to remain beautiful. "You can keep this," she said, and set the brush between them. "It painted our memories. But I am done coloring your shadows." Lydia's face crumpled as if a string had been cut. She pressed her palms to her eyes and made the small sound of someone who has decided to breathe anyway. Ethan did not reach for the brush. His gaze followed a vein in the wood as if the desk were a map, and he might find an exit if he learned how to read it. "I am sorry," he said, and the words did not rescue anyone. They did not try to. Clara closed the box and left it there. She stepped into the hall and found the air clean and unambitious. She walked toward the front door. The quiet did not burden her. It offered itself like a field without fences. Outside, the evening lifted its first stars. Henry stood beside the car with the posture of someone prepared to wait for as long as waiting took. Ella leaned against the passenger door, her hands tucked into her sleeves, a paper crane peeking from her pocket like a small white thought. Clara paused on the porch and let the light fall across her face. The air held that crisp, almost invisible sweetness that arrives when a difficult season verifies its ending. "The past finally dried," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. "Time to paint again." The first snow of the year drifted past the tall windows of the New York Public Library, dissolving against the glass before it could touch the warmth inside. Children's laughter floated through the hall, light and high, like birds testing their wings. Beneath a banner that read the silver brush, "Stories for Every Heart," Clara Weston sat behind a long table signing books whose covers shimmered with quiet color. Her name, once hidden beneath initials and caution, now stood in full light. The silver brush that had begun her journey rested inside a crystal case beside her. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "To remember, not to resent." She lifted her gaze to meet each child's eyes as she signed. Some brought drawings folded in uneven halves, foxes and kites and skies filled with light. Others simply smiled, uncertain of what it meant to meet someone whose stories had walked with them through the dark. Clara thanked each one. She wrote their names with care, adding a small symbol of a fox beside each signature. The world had given her silence once. Now it answered with laughter. When the last line dissolved into soft applause, the librarian approached with a quiet smile. "You have turned the children's wing into sunlight," she said. "The city should thank you." Clara smiled back. "The city already has," she replied. "It let me start over." Outside, the evening had settled into a soft blue. She stepped onto the stone steps and felt the air touch her face. Across the street, Henry Miles leaned against a lamppost, his coat unbuttoned despite the cold. He raised a hand in greeting. Clara descended toward him, her heels striking the stone in slow, even beats, like punctuation after a long sentence. "You were wonderful," he said when she reached him. "You came all the way from San Francisco just to tell me that?" He smiled, but his eyes held an apology that words could not finish. "Not just for that. I wanted to see the proof with my own eyes that you found peace." They walked together through the park, the snow lighting the path in white and shadow. Henry spoke after a silence long enough to be deliberate. "I was so busy measuring profit and loss that I forgot the arithmetic of hours. I let Lydia slip through my fingers and almost lost Ella as well. You reminded me that time is not a ledger. It is a heartbeat." Clara listened, her breath visible in the cold air. "You did what you knew," she said. "We all did." He stopped beneath a lamp whose light fell gently over them both. "You taught me to count moments instead of numbers. That may be the first lesson I have truly learned." His honesty was simple and unadorned, and because of that, it reached her. For a moment she saw not the precise financier he had once been, but the man who had carried a frightened child through a storm, who had knocked on her door with trembling hands, who had stayed when others fled. Gratitude rose in her like warmth from a hearth. She touched his arm lightly. "Then perhaps we are both still learning." They crossed the street and entered a small cafe where the windows were fogged with breath and the air smelled of roasted beans and cinnamon. At a corner table they sat without hurry. Henry spoke of Ella, now 15, who had taken an interest in translating books into other languages. "She says your stories should belong to every child," he said with quiet pride. Clara smiled. "Then she is already braver than we were." He hesitated before adding, "She misses you." "We both do." The words brushed against her heart. "Then tell her to visit the hospital on Saturday." "I will be there." Saturday came dressed in sunlight rather than snow. The children's ward had changed since the last time Clara had walked its halls. The walls were bright with murals of foxes leaping through fields of color. A glass case displayed her book series, each spine a stripe in a rainbow. Nurses nodded as she passed. She paused in front of the case and read the inscription, "Donated by the author who once painted hope here." In the reading room, Ella sat surrounded by small patients wrapped in blankets. Her voice filled the space with warmth as she read aloud from the silver brush. When she reached the line, "Even broken colors can paint something beautiful," she looked up and found Clara standing in the doorway. The girl smiled, her eyes bright, and continued reading until the page ended. When the story was done, Clara joined the circle. Ella leaned her head on her shoulder without a word. Around them, the children clapped. The nurses smiled. For Clara, it was the quietest form of triumph, the kind that did not need applause because it already lived inside the breath of everyone present. Later, when the children were led back to their rooms, Clara and Ella walked to the garden terrace that overlooked the city. Winter sunlight pooled between the buildings, sharp and forgiving. Clara handed the girl a small box. Inside lay the silver brush, newly polished, gleaming with the faint memory of every color it had ever touched. "I thought it belonged in a museum," Ella said softly. "It belongs with someone who still believes in beginnings," Clara answered. "I no longer need it to remember." Ella closed the box carefully. "Then I will use it well." Clara nodded, her throat too full for speech. The breeze lifted a strand of hair across her cheek. Henry appeared at the doorway, watching them with a look that was part wonder, part peace. When Clara met his eyes, he smiled a simple human smile, free of calculation. They left the hospital together as the city lights began to wake. At the corner, Henry paused. "Clara," he said, "when you are ready to decide where home is, I would like to help build it." She met his gaze and saw in it no demand, only an offering. "Perhaps I already have," she said gently, "in every story I finish." They walked on, side by side, through streets that no longer remembered pain, only persistence. Snow began to fall again, softer this time, as if the sky had learned restraint. That night, in her apartment, Clara sat at her desk with a blank canvas before her. She dipped a new brush into water, listening to the faint sound it made like a breath drawn before the first word of a new sentence. Outside, the city hummed, alive and forgiving. She began to paint. As the first stroke met the surface, her voice filled the quiet room, clear and calm. Revenge gave me silence. Forgiveness gave me peace. And peace painted me whole again. The brush moved, steady and sure. The sound of its bristles upon the canvas was soft, but certain the sound of a heart that had finally learned its rhythm. Then, in a single note of stillness, came the final stroke. When a life breaks, it does not always shatter, it sometimes rearranges itself into a new design. Clara's story reminds us that pain, when held with patience, can become a kind of artistry. What was once betrayal did not end her. It sculpted her into someone who understood the quiet mathematics of healing. She learned that forgiveness is not the opposite of justice, it is the moment we stop letting the wound dictate the rhythm of our hearts. In every brushstroke she made, there lived a decision, to remember but not to remain. The silver brush that once trembled in her hand became the compass that led her home. Through it, she discovered that creation is the most profound answer to destruction. The canvas does not ask for perfection. It only asks that we begin again. Perhaps each of us carries our own silver brushed dream, a talent, a voice we once set aside when life grew too loud. Perhaps we, too, can pick it up again and draw the outlines of a gentler tomorrow. It takes courage to paint with colors born from sorrow, but those are the shades that shine longest in the light. If Clara's journey spoke to you, if you have ever stood in the silence after a storm, wondering how to start again, then take this story with you. Let it remind you that endings are not final, they're invitations. Every heartbreak, every lost promise, every moment you thought would finish, you can still be rewritten into something luminous. And as you leave this story behind, pause for a moment. Think of the one thing you have been too afraid to begin, the letter you never sent, the apology you never voiced, the dream you have delayed. Maybe tonight is the night to draw the first line. Tell us what you felt. Tell us where the story touched you. Share your own beginning below, because sometimes another person's courage is waiting in your words. If you wish to walk further with stories that speak of loss, love, and the quiet strength between them, stay with us. There are more canvases to uncover, more silver brushes waiting to find their light. In the end, life is not measured by what breaks us, but by what we choose to create after the breaking. Like Clara, may we all learn to turn our pain into paint and our forgiveness into the final, most beautiful stroke.